The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin, Jeong. U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin have agreed on a halt in Russian attacks against Ukrainian energy targets. However, there was no agreement from the Russian president for Washington's proposed full 30-day ceasefire in Russia's invasion of its pro-Western neighbor, Ukraine. Now, Russia has launched a series of devastating attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure throughout the three-year-old war. According to the Kremlin, Ukraine, which has bombed multiple Russian oil installations, had also agreed to the truce on energy targets, although Kyiv had yet to comment. Now, have any major breakthroughs been made, though? And will Trump be the deciding factor in ending the three-year-old war between Russia and Ukraine? Well, joining us today is Dr. Dana Allin, who is a senior fellow and adjunct professor of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and SAIS-Europe of Johns Hopkins University. Hi, Dr. Dana. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, the recent agreement between Putin and Trump to halt Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure for 30 days has been hailed as a potential step towards peace. Is this a step in the right direction? Is this agreement really a potential step towards peace, Doctor?
Well, let me start with a brief positive word, which was probably the only positive thing I'll say. It's always good when you reach agreements, and if there's a cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure and it really holds, you never know where that might lead. As a rule, I always think diplomacy is a good thing, and diplomatic achievements are a good thing. But as you indicated in your introduction, Trump failed in what he said he was trying to achieve, which was already very limited. He wanted a full, albeit short-term ceasefire. So overall, I don't think this is a very positive or certainly not a huge breakthrough.
I see. But why might the focus on energy targets say about the strategic objectives of both sides?
Well, attacks on energy infrastructure have been important and damaging to both sides. There was a real concern this winter that Russia was basically going to be able to shut down Ukraine's energy grid and cause, huge, devastating suffering. Well, the winter's almost over. They didn't really achieve that, so Ukraine held out against it. Conversely, the Ukrainians have been doing some damage to Russian infrastructure, and of course Russia is hugely dependent on energy sales, so basic national income. So, the energy is obviously important to both sides. There's not really much more to say about that. And, it could be, again, as I said at the beginning, in diplomatic terms, in a normal condition, if both sides wanted an end to the war, something like this could be the beginning of a rapprochement, but I'm highly skeptical on the Russian side.
I see. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Putin agreed to pause strikes on energy infrastructure, but he did reject the proposal for a full 30-day ceasefire, which had been pushed by the U.S. What factors do you think might be contributing to Putin's reluctance to accept a broader ceasefire at this time?
Look, Putin has been very clear throughout this whole process, and it's been almost, tragically comic to see President Trump talking about a ceasefire at the time, all the while that Putin has been saying he's not really interested in a limited ceasefire. Putin has consistently said he wants an agreement that deals with the fundamental issues of the war. And those are, from the Russian perspective, far-reaching, to put it mildly. They've called for a rollback of NATO's presence on the territory of its eastern members. And, really, Putin and the Russians have been consistently saying that, they don't think Ukraine is a real country and that it should exist. They've called for the denazification of Ukraine, which is, of course, a grotesque absurdity when Ukraine has a Jewish president. So, you could argue that Putin should take the ceasefire to make Donald Trump happy, but he seems pretty determined to keep fighting the war.
I see. Well, what might Putin perceive as the potential consequence of, agreeing to a full ceasefire then?
Well, he has, I will put it in rather dark terms. He does seem to have Trump more in his camp than in the Ukrainian camp.
Right.
And I suppose that he risks losing that position if he agrees to a ceasefire and then brazenly breaks it. In other words, he doesn't really want to necessarily test how far to push President Trump. Maybe President Trump would develop a new and more pro-Ukrainian view of the conflict. I mean, that's a delicate issue because, he risks that by not agreeing to a ceasefire as well. But if he's absolutely determined to continue the war, I suppose that it's maybe tactically better for him to sort of continue dragging the process out with things like this limited agreement on infrastructure, on energy.
I see. Well, in the Kremlin statement, it stated that a key condition for peace would be ending Western military and intelligence support to Ukraine's embattled military. What does this entail, and how will this be perceived by Kyiv and European capitals that have already accused Mr. Putin of stalling?
I think they'll perceive it as meaning that President Putin wants what he has indicated he wants, which is to end the existence of Ukraine. I mean, if that were a demand that he really held to, it would confirm the worst fears of the Ukrainian and the NATO-Europe side of diplomacy, which is that Putin would use a ceasefire. I mean, we don't have a ceasefire, but if we had one, he would use a ceasefire to rest and rebuild his forces and expect that Ukraine wasn't able to do the same thing. So, I think that demand in and of itself suggests that Mr. Putin is not really serious about seeking peace.
I see. Well, after this agreement between Trump and Putin, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine was favorable to a U.S. proposed truce on strikes against energy infrastructure endorsed by Russia, but needed more details from Washington first. Does this show a reluctance on Ukraine's part of this agreement?
I think Ukraine is suspicious of the agreement, and probably rightfully so. Uh-huh. But, Zelensky learned a lesson when he came to Washington and tried to explain his view of the conflict to President Trump and Vice President Vance, antagonizing. Well, I mean, I think it was actually a setup, and they intended to berate and humiliate him from the start. But in any event, he's, I think, going to be more careful to try to, do what he can to appease President Trump. And so, if there is an agreement, if this turns out to be something like a real agreement, I suspect the Ukrainians will accept it.
I see. Well, Mr. Zelensky also warned that Mr. Putin wanted to weaken Ukraine and was not ready to end this war. Could this be the case? I mean, is Mr. Putin just putting up a persona for agreement talks, especially as a ceasefire deal has not been met?
Absolutely. I think that's the suspicion, and there's a lot of evidence for it. As I said at the beginning, President Putin has been completely consistent, saying he's not interested in a short-term ceasefire. He's interested in settling the fundamental issues of the war, and these are so far-reaching that they would, not entail a sovereign Ukraine that could defend itself.
I see. Well, there has been a growing concern as well among some of Trump's critics that his approach to Russia may lean toward appeasement, particularly in regard to Putin's demands. How would you assess Trump's position in these negotiations then? Do you think his desire to end the conflict could lead to, too many concessions to Russia?
Yeah, I think that's a very mild way of putting it. Since President Trump returned to the White House, he has, made statements such as, absurd statements such as Ukraine started the war, really putting the pressure on Ukraine rather than pressure on President Putin, which he's, given really a number of concessions, at least rhetorical concessions. He cut off, albeit for a short time, but he cut off aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which was damaging in itself, but it could have been really, really devastating. Appeasement towards the Russians is really, I think, the mildest way you can put this. Some people think that the United States has switched sides in the war.
I see. So how does his personal stance, Trump's personal stance here toward Russia, impact the broader diplomatic efforts to bring about peace?
It weakens them. The American president has made a series of gestures since he came back into the White House that I think the Kremlin thinks that it can push and push and push. There will be very little resistance on the American side. I want to say, I'm speaking very harshly here. I'm all in favor of diplomacy. And I would hope that there would be a diplomatic.
Right.
Almost all wars will end with diplomacy, and I think this one will too. But it would require the Kremlin to be convinced that Western support for Ukraine will continue as long as necessary. And that's the exact thing that Trump has indicated is not going to happen. So, it's the worst possible strategy for trying to conduct actual diplomacy.
I see. Well, moving forward then, how do you think the U.S. will continue to navigate the balancing act between Trump's rhetoric and the broader foreign policy strategy?
To be honest, I'm not sure what the broader foreign policy strategy of the United States is beyond Trump's rhetoric. I mean, you can identify certain groups in kind of the foreign policy firmament. There are some traditional Republicans, such as the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who I think in his gut is pro-Ukrainian and believes that Russia, is the aggressor, which is obviously the case. But, all I've seen from this faction of traditional Republicans is sort of running behind Mr. Trump, trying to formulate policy around President Trump's pronouncements. There is also, in the broader kind of MAGA ideological firmament, there is people like Vice President Vance who, have consistently expressed the argument that they don't really care about Ukraine, that that's not what American foreign policy should be about. And, this goes even on the extreme right to some very pro-Russian characters. So the coherence, you're asking for the sort of trying to bridge the idea of Mr. Trump's own persona versus a more coherent set continuing American foreign policy goals. But I'm not really sure those underlying goals are obvious right now.
I see. Before we let you go here, what more developments will you be watching in regards to this? I
mean, I would say maybe two things are really important. The first one is there anything that President Putin could do that would really alienate Donald Trump? I mean, there have been moments in the past 2 months where President Trump has indicated, if the Russians don't come to the table and seriously negotiate, that he would try to really lower energy prices. I'm not sure how effective he would be at that, but really try to devastate Russia's main source of foreign income and impose greater sanctions. I mean, we already have pretty great sanctions on Russia. But anyway, is there, if it were possible Putin to really alienate Trump, this would be something to watch. But the second thing, and I think it's really more fundamental, is the role of European allies in NATO. As they've watched really with dismay this behavior from the White House, they've made very big statements and talked about increasing their defense spending and really taking responsibility for an autonomous European security capability, and also to continue to supporting Ukraine. And can they do that without the United States? I'd say it's going to be difficult, but it shouldn't be impossible. And so I'd say those are the two big things looking forward that I would be interested in.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Doctor, for your time and your insights today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. That was Dr. Dana Allin, who is a senior fellow and adjunct professor of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and SAIS-Europe of the Johns Hopkins University. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.